Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone here and welcome. I think we'll probably still get a few people calling in, but we need to begin. We've got a busy schedule. So I hope everyone had a great holiday weekend. My name is Darrin Thome, and I'm the Associate Regional Director for USGS's Southwest region here in Sacramento. It was wonderful to see how many people showed up for today's wildfire science workshop between USGS and State of California agencies. So today's workshop is covering the topics of land cover change, ecosystem response, and post-fire hazards. And this is the first of 3 being held in the next week or so. These workshops are the result of recent conversations between USGS and the California Natural Resources Agency, and it's designed to foster a greater communication between USGS science and the information needs of the state of California. So today we have 5 scientific talks, each of which will be 10 minutes of presentation followed by 10 minutes of discussion. Our goal is to provide a snapshot of various wildfire topics on which USGS has been working, along with an opportunity to begin a dialogue on each topic. We encourage your questions after each presentation and look forward to a robust dialogue. One quick request I have for you all, it's going to help our bandwidth for this meeting if you turn off your cameras unless you're asking a question. In which case we encourage you to turn your camera on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Loretta Moreno with the California Natural Resources Agency for a few remarks of her own.
Good morning. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend. This is Loretta Moreno with the Natural Resource Agency. I'm a senior environmental scientist working in forest resource management, monitoring, and planning. I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks to the entire USGS team for putting on this workshop series and reaching out to the state in a time like this with all of our climate change and wildfire challenges, among other challenges we're confronting, and the interest of providing the latest in science, data, tools, and other analytical resources that the state may consider as we're approaching all of our individual challenges in our departments. And so mainly, this is a thanks to USGS for providing this, and hopefully the dialogue to come will result in more collaboration as we move forward. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Loretta. So before we start our scientific presentations, we have some introductory remarks from Keith Miles, who's the director of our Western Ecological Research Center. So Keith.
Good morning. Just short comments before I introduce our first speaker. A primary objective of the USGS Ecosystems Mission Area and its research centers, such as the Western Ecological Research Center, which I direct, and whose scientists you will hear from first this morning, is to provide science-based information for effective management of natural resources. The primary users and funders of the Western Ecological Research Center's wildfire-based research in California are Department of Interior agencies, in particular the National Park Service, where John Keeley and Phil Van Mantgem are co-located, the Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but it is inclusive of other federal entities such as the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Defense, in particular Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, U.S. Army Fort Erin, U.S. Navy Command San Clemente Island and China Lake. Our scientists also work closely with state agencies like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and California State Parks, and local agencies such as those under the umbrella of the Southern California Council of Governments. While the majority of research conducted by research centers of the Ecosystem Mission Area is application-oriented, there are specialists with focused expertise, as exemplified by the duties of senior scientists like Dr. John Keeley, who you will hear from in just shortly. This is not to suggest that Dr. Keeley is not actively engaged in applied science, but he is an internationally recognized as an ecologist who specializes in synthesizing data and information on the role of fire in Mediterranean and forested ecosystems, and the contributions of multiple variables such as climate, plant community structure, and human effects that can influence the frequency and severity of fire in these systems. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. John Keeley.
I'm going to talk about fuel treatments in chaparral type vegetation. This is an area that's really been neglected in many ways, in large part because forest fuel treatments are perhaps much more critical in many parts of the state. But fuel treatments are a very contentious issue in chaparral landscapes. There's a lot of environmental resistance against its use. A lot of what we know about prescription burning has to do with burning in coniferous forest. There's a great deal of work that's been done in that vegetation type. And when we come up with a prescription in forests, there are a number of things that are always considered: temperature, relative humidity, wind conditions. But another important factor is stand age. And stand age is critically important in distinguishing differences between coniferous forests and chaparral. Next. Conifer forests historically have been adapted to short fire return intervals and keeping fuel loads at a level that minimize fire hazard are actually compatible with species tolerance. This is not the case with chaparral vegetation. These shrublands are adapted to long fire return intervals, and reducing fuel loads to be compatible with community resilience is often not compatible with the resilience of many of the shrub species in this system. In other words, what we need to do in order to reduce fire hazard in shrublands is to burn at short intervals, whereas the resilience of the species is threatened at short intervals. It's an example of what ecologists would call a wicked problem. Go ahead, next. This is just an illustration of what happens when we burn at short intervals. This landscape here, the entire landscape was burned in 1970 in the Laguna Fire in San Diego County. The bottom half of this area was burned again in 2001, and that was like a 31-year fire return interval, which is compatible with chaparral resilience. Most of what you see in this image here is natural regeneration of chaparral, but the corner foreground here was burned again in 2003, and this unnatural short return interval eliminated many of the native species, and the tan color here is all brome grass that is invaded, and this is a major concern by environmentalists. Next. As a general rule, when we have short return intervals, we often see type conversion of the vegetation. For example, this landscape here in the Santa Monica Mountains hasn't burned in about 30 years. It's intact native chaparral shrubland. This area on the right has burned 3 times in 12 years, and we've type converted it to mostly exotic grasses. And this is a problem for a lot of reasons. It reduces natural biodiversity, increases invasion of non-natives, produces a much longer fire season, it reduces slope stability, and the grasses themselves increase fire frequency in a feedback process that accelerates type conversion. Next. This is just an illustration of some data in a paper we currently have in review where we've looked across Southern California at those characteristics that are tied into type conversion. And this is defined by this parameter we call woody plant decline. And the pink bars here indicate departure from what we consider a natural fire regime as being an important driver. Other factors are at play too. For example, slope aspect plays a role, as well as actual evapotranspiration. Both of these, though, however, are probably tied into this fire parameter because species that are most sensitive to short interval fires are also associated with south-facing slopes and with very arid slopes. Go ahead, next. Now, the question is why does chaparral have this sensitivity to short intervals? Well, it doesn't apply to all the species. Some species can tolerate short intervals quite well. And this is illustrated by this slide here that shows resprouting scrub oak. Oaks do very well with short intervals. They resprout vigorously, as you can see here. And so they're not affected by short intervals. We also have some species like chamise, which are able to resprout, but they also produce seedlings after a fire, what we call facultative resprouters. They're not dependent entirely on resprouting. Next. But the real sensitive part of our flora is what we call obligate seeders, like this manzanita species here, Arctostaphylos glauca, doesn't have any capacity for resprouting, has to come back from seeds. and that means it has to have a period of time to produce a seed bank. Next. And this is not a minor issue in chaparral. This is an illustration of the different functional responses to fire. Obligate resprouters, they resprout vigorously. They don't produce any seedlings after a fire. Facultative resprouters also can resprout. Obligate seeders, no resprouting, and all their seedlings come up right after fire. And they comprise the dominant flora in our shrubland system. 60% of the species are obligate seeders. So a large part of our flora is affected by short fire return intervals where the obligate seeders simply don't have enough time to regenerate the seed bank. Next. So basically, the chaparral we could describe as having potential for creating very dangerous fuel loads, particularly because it occurs in proximity with many metropolitan landscapes. Short intervals have the potential for exterminating or extirpating a significant number of the species. So a major management challenge is how do we reduce fire hazard in this ecosystem and yet retain biodiversity? And one of our questions we're working on at the current time is what is the minimal fire return interval that we can burn this vegetation and it will not result in species extirpation and invasion of alien grasses. Next. This is just an illustration of the sort of data we're trying to collect, and this is sort of a pilot study we did this summer where we looked at fires that occurred in 2020, one in San Diego, the Valley Fire, and another in Monterey, the Dolan Fire. And these fires burned across mature vegetation, which is vegetation that we would consider to be compatible with regeneration after fire. And then they also overlapped with earlier fires that were relatively immature stands, and we can compare then the impact of short fire return intervals with more natural long intervals. And what we see is some species like chamise, Adenostoma fasciculatum, doesn't seem to be heavily impacted. The same amount of resprouting occurs in the immature stand as well as the mature stand. They produce similar levels of seedlings per pre-fire shrub. There are other species that are obligate seeders that also seem to be compatible with a 14-year interval as well. Ceanothus gregii still has seedlings after fire, but it's a substantial drop over what we would see in a more mature stand. So there is some potential impact if we're burning at 14-year intervals. And then there are other species like this manzanita here that when we compare seedling recruitment in after fire in mature stands with fire after 14 years, we're at a level of one seedling per pre-fire shrub, and considering thinning rates, that species is likely to decline on those sites. And when it declines, that area is likely to be invaded by invasive grasses. Another example from the Dolan Fire in Monterey County, Adenostoma seems to do okay when we have a 12-year fire interval, but here we have an 8-year fire interval, and we see that although it still resprouts, it's not producing any seedlings, and so it's potentially impacted by an 8-year fire return interval. Ceanothus cuneatus, an obligate cedar known as buckbrush, produces substantial seedlings in older stands, but greatly reduced in a 12-year stand and essentially extirpated from the site in an 8-year stand. And the same with this other manzanita species, simply extirpated at, well, even 12-year intervals, because 0.2 seedlings per pre-fire shrub is likely to result in a dramatic decline in that species. So just to summarize, what our concern is if we're going to use prescription burning in these stands, we have to have a better understanding of what the tolerance levels are for species in order to balance the reduction in fire hazard with conservation values. And I'll end it there.
Great, thanks. Thank you, John. I think if there's any questions to this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, John and Keith. Yeah, so we've got ample time for questions, comments, thoughts from anyone. Please feel free to either raise your hand or in the chat box type your question, and we'll start taking questions. Who's got the first question? Looks like Adam Moreno. Let's see. Yep, Adam, you're up.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm Adam Moreno with the California Air Resources Board. Thanks for the great presentation, John. So just curious, so what do you recommend to decrease these the fire frequency then if we're getting too high a fire frequency, practically speaking, what do you recommend there?
Well, I think in terms of chaparral landscapes, the number one determinant of whether or not we get fires on that landscape are human ignitions. And that's almost certainly the primary area where we can focus to reduce these impacts of too frequent of fires. For example, we just recently finished a study that was published in Science Advances that looked at our worst fires, which are the Santa Ana wind-driven fires in the autumn, and looked at how climate has affected that. And the bottom line is climate doesn't seem to play a big role. What was the primary determinant over 71 years of Santa Ana wind-driven fires was numbers of ignitions. And that's where we really need to focus effort. And there really hasn't been a good exploration of all of the ways we might reduce ignition. Certainly, one of the big ones is power line ignitions. And in fact, in this study that I just mentioned, over that 71-year period, power line ignitions were the number one cause of area burned during Santa Ana wind-driven fires. And so certainly there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of reducing power line ignited fires. And there's some evidence that there are things that can be done. For example, San Diego Gas and Electric started a program in 2007 to try and reduce the power line ignitions. And as a result, although prior to 2007, they had massive losses from power line ignited fires, since 2007, San Diego County hasn't had any power line ignited fires of any significant size. So there is the potential for changing that. The other thing is arson. That's another big cause. And there are things we can do. For example, some of the fire safe councils have started red flag day patrols in their neighborhood to try and catch people who might be tempted to ignite fires. So there are things we can do, and my feeling is we haven't really explored fire prevention to the level that it really needs to be explored. And this is particularly important in chaparral because essentially all of the fires during Santa Ana wind-driven conditions are started by people. And this is only going to get worse because the state is growing. For the last 50 years, California has been increasing at the rate of 300,000 people a year. We've added 6 million more people since the year 2000. So with population growth not being controlled, and there's no evidence that that's going to change, we need to be concerned about how do we prevent human ignitions.
Great. Just follow-up question real quick. Okay, so beyond just stopping ignitions, you don't see a role for management to help this issue at all?
Well, there's certainly a need for management around developments. While we don't necessarily find in Southern California fuel treatments in chaparral landscape play a big role in stopping big fires, they're certainly important in producing defensible space around homes. And so probably the most important role that management can play in chaparral landscapes is to ensure that communities maintain defensible space around their homes. And beyond maybe 100 foot from the home, there's limited evidence that management of fuels is necessarily going to change outcomes.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, John. Looks like Nick Estes, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy's got a question.
Hi, good morning. Yes, thank you. And good morning, John. So piggybacking on Adam's question, and I think insinuated in the final part of your presentation is, indication of max prescribed fire rates, et cetera, from the shorter FRIs. Now in conifer forests, we use prescribed fire to hopefully get a lower severity prescription on there, something that reinforces the stability of the ecosystems in those forests. I'm getting the sense from your responses to Adam, as well as the end of your presentation, that such prescribed fires in these systems don't help reinforce the stability in the systems, but in fact potentially has similar severity as a normal suppression fire in those systems. Is that true?
Yes, we've done some fairly extensive studies looking at fire severity and post-fire recovery of chaparral. The bottom line is high severity conditions do not reduce regeneration or reduce diversity after fires. These systems are adapted to very high severity fires. And in fact, the only correlation that we can find with severity is as severity goes down, it increases invasives coming into the system. And that's sort of a complicated problem. It's largely due to the fact that if the system has already been type converted to grasses, the severity will go down, and the invasive grass seed bank is already there, and so they go up. So high severity fires are not a problem for chaparral regeneration. It's the low severity fires that are probably the biggest threat to the ecology of these systems. And that's quite different than the role of severity on fire hazard in areas adjacent to chaparral, where high severity is a real problem. So like I said, this is really one of those wicked problems where we want to reduce severity to increase the community protection, but at the same time, when we do that, we threaten the resources.
Thanks for that question, Nick. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask, either in the chat or please raise your hand? We do have time.
I might just add one other comment about this wicked problem of how do you reduce fire hazard and maintain resources. And none of this is meant to suggest that resources should necessarily have priority over fire hazard reduction. I think we always have to be concerned about public safety. But what this says is we need to take a cost-benefit analysis of the situation. If we're going to do fuel treatments in this landscape, we need to have good evidence that it's actually going to make a difference in terms of reducing fires, because we know that it's going to result in resource sacrifice. So the important message that I tell managers is we need to look at the cost and the benefits. And if you're going to do fuel treatments, you need to have good evidence that it's actually going to make a difference. And in our worst fires, which are driven by extreme winds, landscape scale fuel treatments generally don't do much in terms of stopping those fires. It's important around homes, but beyond that, it's probably a bigger cost than it is a benefit.
John, you mentioned that the vast majority of these ignitions are human-caused ignitions. Can you give us a sense of the type of human ignitions you're talking about? Accidental, sparks. What exactly are they?
Well, it's changed over time. If you go back, 50 years, smoking was a big ignition source. Today, smoking isn't a big issue, and part of that is probably due to changes in smoking habits. But campfires used to be a big cause. Today, in the last 2 decades, our biggest causes are arson and power line failures. And in this 71-year study that we did, in Southern California, the last decade, almost 100% of the area burned was due to power line failures.
Thanks for that, John. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the questions. We'll shift gears to Phil Van Mantgem now. He's going to give a talk on forest management, fire hazards, and carbon sequestration.
Great, thank you. This is an image of the 2016 rough fire making a run through drought-impacted mixed conifer forests. So we're switching gears here to talk about coniferous forests. Note the standing dead trees from the high severity drought. And to me, this image is emblematic of some of the challenges we're facing with forest management in California. In conifer forests, we're seeing increasing fire frequency, size, and sometimes increasing fire severity. And the current Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire are 2 immediate examples. And why are we seeing this? We're living in a legacy of over a century of fire exclusion that's led to high surface fuel loads and the infilling of small trees. And these are fuels for fires. In addition, we have warming trends that are leading to drier fuels that more readily carry fire. Next slide. So what can we do to mitigate the fuels problem? We really only have two tools in our toolbox, prescribed fire and mechanical thinning. So these methods are often combined on the same stand. And prescribed fire is simply igniting a fire under low to moderate severity fire weather conditions to consume fuels. And mechanical thinning is the physical removal of shrubs and small trees. And so how do we know if these treatments are effective? Next slide. So the most direct way to measure effects is through repeated observations of permanent forest plots. So as Yogi Berra said, you can observe a lot just by watching. And a lot of my work has relied on the National Park Service database of fire effects. These are also known as FMH plots or the FFI database. And there's hundreds of these plots in California national parks. This effort started sometime in the late 1980s, depending on the park, and the plots are repeatedly surveyed at regular intervals. The plot network mostly covered prescribed fire burning treatments, which is primarily the tool that the National Park Service uses. And they're focused in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, which is where the fire hazard is concentrated. So the data is less well represented in terms of other treatment types and other forest types, such as coastal redwood forests. So what have we learned from these plots? Well, first of all, prescribed fire works in this system. It reduces fire hazards in terms of surface fuels for about 15 years. The reduction in the number of small trees is longer lasting with a duration, as far as we can tell, over 20 years. But there are highly variable outcomes, so there's a lot left to understand. So if you look at the plot-to-plot variability in outcomes, we can see general trends, but there's a lot of variability. Next slide. We can also use these plot-based data in other useful ways. For example, we can look at interactions between fire injuries and drought stress that cause post-fire tree mortality, which is a key outcome of fire. So that's often just used as an index of fire severity. And post-fire tree mortality probabilities are typically estimated by assessing the amount of the tree crown that is killed by a fire, a measurement known as crown volume scorched. And using these data, we found that drought stress or moisture deficit mediates that response to crown scorch. That is, given the same amount of crown scorch, a tree with high pre-fire drought stress is more likely to die following a fire. And this information can help managers plan for expected fire effects. And we're taking these data and expanding it to use other data. And the ultimate goal is to integrate these relationships into fire planning tools, such as the first order fire effects model, or FOFM. Next slide. So what happens when drought follows a prescribed fire? So using these long-term forest plot data, we've learned that after the initial pulse of mortality following a prescribed fire, forests with a history of treatment had reduced mortality during the recent 2012 to 2016 drought. That is, burned areas had a higher resistance to the drought. And here we can see that in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, the mortality during the drought was lower in burned areas for both common fir and pine species, at least for the smaller trees. And we think this is at least partially a result of less dense stands after a history of treatment. For the larger trees, we didn't really see that effect, and we likely think that's because these larger trees are less affected by competition, and also there is selection by bark beetles on larger trees. Next slide. So can we translate these plot-based observations into tools that are useful for managers? Here's an example that we call the PostScript tool. And we developed this in partnership with the Forest Service and University of California, and we're using plot-based observations to create a tool that predicts natural conifer regeneration following wildfire. And this provides a key estimate of the potential for forest recovery, and that has implications for the eventual return of important ecosystem services such as forest carbon, clean water, and wildlife habitat. The tool creates a high-resolution map at a scale that's useful for management planning activities. And in fact, the tool is already being used by managers in the Forest Service for post-fire recovery actions such as seeding and planting. Next slide. The tool runs on open source software and has a very simple user interface. So if you were to run the tool, this is what you'd see. This is what first comes up. It has a broad spatial coverage drawing on data from over 1,000 plots across 19 wildfires in California. An important feature of the tool is that it uses information that's quickly available after a fire. That is estimates of burn severity from Landsat data and also just the fire perimeter data. Next slide. And here's some of the outcomes for it. It produces a map that looks like this. Here's an example of the 2014 King Fire. And we know from earlier studies that conifer recruitment will differ depending on post-fire precipitation and just year-to-year variability in seed output. And the tool has the ability for managers to adjust those outputs and come up with different scenarios on what the post-fire condition might look like. So again, this helps managers decide where post-fire seeding and planting might be most useful. And I'd also like to note that these estimates could be updated using different climates. Next slide. So we've learned a lot, but we also have a long way to go. In terms of forest management, one of the outstanding questions that I think we have facing us right now is how do we want to modify these treatments given current conditions? That is, we understand sort of the historic range of variability pretty well, but it's somewhat of an open question whether how well those that historic range of variability will be useful going forward under warming conditions. For fire hazards, again, we have highly variable outcomes among plots suggest that there's a lot we don't understand yet. And I think additional data sources will be key. For example, using comparable data from, say, FIA plots or other plot sources, so we could extend our results to different ownerships, different management treatments, and different forest types. For example, coastal redwood forests. Another outstanding question we have is how do we scale up? So science often provides insights into management strategies, that is sort of broad results and relationships, but managers often want information that can inform tactics at very fine spatial scales. So currently I'm working with Karen Thorne at USGS to use drone-based surveys to get a better understanding of the effects of, for example, the 2018 Carr Fire at Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, and also the 2020 Caldwell Fire at Lava Beds National Monument, both in California. And finally, carbon. So a new direction that we're taking our work is to consider the consequences of these treatments on forest carbon stocks. For example, what are the expected losses from forest carbon from these treatments? So if we're removing trees, we're obviously removing carbon, but how much? And how long are those losses detectable? And probably most importantly, do we expect the increased stability of forest carbon stocks following these treatments? That is, will we have increased stability following these treatments when we're faced with additional stressors such as repeated droughts or beetle outbreaks or wildfire? All right, I'll stop there, and if there's questions, I'll be happy to try and field them. Thank you.
Bill, thanks for that. Appreciate your consciousness of our time here. It looks like Loretta has her hand up.
Hi, thank you for that great presentation. I just want to clarify, and it could be on your knowledge gap slide here, were you suggesting certain areas of focus you're embarking on regarding these items? Just so I know what's coming in the research side.
Oh, yeah. So definitely carbon. We're looking into that upcoming using, again, this National Park Service database and some other observations. The scaling up, we're currently looking at how we can take some of our plot-based data. And frankly, you know, the area that we can actually physically cover with these plot-based stuff is fairly small relative to the landscape or an area that gets burned. And so the question is, how can we intelligently extrapolate out those results across a landscape? So we're using UAS or drone surveys to try and do that more intelligently than we have in the past.
Thank you. I might follow up with you on some of this because there's a lot of these gaps here that we're keenly interested in. So maybe I'll email you after the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Please do, by all means. Looks like Keith's got a question, and then Adam Moreno after that.
No, I just had a comment, Darrin, because I don't know if any people it was clear that Dr. Van Mantgem is a research ecologist who specializes in factors that affect forest health in California, and that he is co-located with the Redwood National and State Parks in Arcata, California. So I just wanted to point that out because I don't think that was clear.
Thanks for that, Keith. Appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. That's, you know, that is one thing that another sort of knowledge gap that I think we have right now, especially in coastal redwood forests. I mean, that's an iconic forest type in California, and we have partners with the state parks up here too. And I think up until maybe the CZU fire, which was very much of a wake-up call for people up here in the North Coast, that we can get big fires up here, and we've had recent examples up in Brookings as well, not in the not too long ago past. And so there's a lot of fuel on the landscape, and typically we thought it's too foggy essentially to burn very frequently. But one of the questions I have certainly going forward is what are the hazards? And as that continental climate starts creeping in towards the coast, how will that change? Are we looking for potential sort of differences in fire regimes here along the North Coast? And I think there's potential for that.
Thanks, Phil. Adam, you're up next.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I have a comment and then a question. Comment is this losses from treatments. Yeah, for sure. Like a lot of interest from their resources board for that. We already are trying to report this every 5 years, I guess, is our reporting frequency. But yeah, we don't do research. We take other people's research and put it into reports and make statewide assessments. So yeah, that research is super important and needed. I'll have the same question for the soils person coming up later. So the soil impacts from forest management. Question about the tool you were showing, the post-gen or post-regen tool. So is the point of the tool to show where natural regeneration is likely or unlikely? Is that what I understood?
That's it exactly. Yeah. So it's one potential tool in the toolbox if you were to start planning planting or seeding treatments following a fire. It would give you at least our best estimate at what the future holds for a particular fire perimeter, given the fire severity. So how likely it is for natural regeneration to occur on a sort of across an entire burned area. And okay. So you could couple that, obviously, managers would want to take that information as just one part of the planning tool or one part of the planning process. So it would be a GIS layer that you could incorporate into your planning. So you'd have to obviously work in local knowledge of this area. The estimates are only going to be as good as the data that goes into it. And some of it's fairly coarse resolution in terms of the fire severity and also what the existing conifer forests actually look like. There's other tools out there that are being developed by colleagues of ours too, looking at actual success of these treatments, trying to incorporate sort of a better understanding of some of the topography and the soil types. So again, it's one piece of the puzzle, but hopefully a useful piece.
Great, thanks.
Adam, if I could ask you a question, you mentioned that you've got an obligation to report carbon losses. Are there targets that the state of California is shooting for that prompts your reporting?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. Yeah, so that is what we are currently developing with the Air Resources Board. So the CARB is the state's climate change planning agency, and so every 5 years we do this thing called the scoping plan, and in the past it's focused on reducing emissions from fossil fuels, but now we have a goal of being carbon neutral, which means taking into account the whole carbon budget of the state. And so nature-based climate solutions are playing a much larger role in this upcoming scoping plan, which is to be reported out next year. And in that scoping plan, we have to set carbon targets for every ecosystem in California. So,
wow,
it's a tall order. Thanks for that, Adam. Any other questions? We do have ample time for questions for Phil. Someone had their hand up earlier and it dropped, but if you still have that question lingering in your mind, please do ask it. Nadia.
Hi, I had a question, but I answered it myself. I was thinking about the tool that the Forest Service had come out with, but it's the same tool. So it looks like you guys are all working in partnership. The question that I do have is, have you used this tool, or is there a publication that has kind of gone through the existing, more recent, large high severity fires on the landscape to kind of provide some kind of an assessment of how much post-fire area is out there that would benefit from reforestation due to an unlikely natural seed source availability?
Okay, if I understand your question correctly, is there a publication that sort of accompanies this, that sort of steps you through it? A couple of things. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, there's certainly a scientific publication that came out this year in Ecological Applications. And if we can flip back a couple slides, there's a citation for it. I could also send it around to the group. Be happy to do that. One more. Yeah, so down at the bottom, Stewart, Van Mantgem et al., 2020 in Ecological Applications. Also, if you go to the tool itself, there's also sort of a help me page that sort of goes through at least the basics of what the tool does and what you should expect from it. So we have lots and lots of documentation of it.
I guess what I'm asking is, have you done a statewide assessment of the recent fire footprints to provide some kind of number of acres or areas that would really benefit from reforestation at this point?
That's not something we've done. Right now, I think one of the things that we'd like to do with this tool, and Joseph Stewart, who is a student contractor with us at USGS, and he's taken on sort of taking this tool to another step too, is looking at reburned areas, which is what we don't have. So there's a lot of fires, obviously in 2020 and now 2021, and trying to get an understanding, like, how does that affect the outcomes that we're predicting with the current tool? So there's a lot we could still do. And so a question like that, we haven't really addressed, but I think that'd be very interesting.
Thank you.
I think they're also varied by ownership as well. So again, I work a lot with the National Park Service, and they take a much more, what would be the correct word here, hands-off approach to post-fire management. So, but the Forest Service is more open to using tools such as planting and seeding.
Thanks for that question, Nadia. Looks like Keith's got a question.
Hey, Phil, you indicated a likelihood of more terrestrial climate influence rather than oceanic. Are you seeing evidence of that now in your coastal systems that you're looking at? And do you predict, can you predict what kind of changes might occur, and will those changes be more fire prone that you might be seeing right now?
So in terms of what we're seeing here in the North Coast, this will be different in the redwood environment, say down in Santa Cruz or closer to San Francisco in the Bay Area. But up here, we're not really seeing strong trends right here on the coast, but you don't have to go too far inland to start seeing warming trends. So just out of the redwood zone, the trends are pretty clear as far as increasing temperatures. We're not really seeing much in terms of any sort of trends in precipitation. Fog obviously is a very key component to the system up here, and that's still, Alicia could probably enlighten us better on that, but that's still a very complicated question on what's going to happen in the future. So there's some unknowns there, but it looks like things, that sort of continental climate has the potential to start getting closer to the coast, and that would dry out the ample fuels that we have here, and so that would increase our hazards, and that's the worry that we have right now. So currently, like we have a fire burning up in the northern part of our park right now, but it's not going anywhere. They're just sort of observing it. And so potential in the future, something like that might have the potential to take off a little bit more.
Appreciate that question, Keith. Looks like Ashley Omida with the Water Boards has got a question.
Hi, yes, I do have a question regarding the tool. If there's a factor that accounts for impacts to soil fertility post fire efforts, and how that affects the success of revegetation.
So quick answer to that is not right now. No, we tried to sort of build in earlier iterations questions like that, and we just didn't feel like we had the proper data for it yet, or not the data that we felt was reliable. So that might. It would be interesting to pull that off where you had good soil mapping data like that, but right now we're just sort of, it had to end up being sort of a question for future research.
Good question. Did you have a follow-up, Ashley?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question. Loretta.
Thanks. Just to follow on that. So if there's I think I heard there's a data gap. So what sort of soil data is missing that if you had it, you could start to get at that question? Because obviously that affects the viability of any restoration endeavor.
Well, certainly the question that just brought up fertility, I think would be good. Even just a good understanding of sort of the soil depth and the water holding capacity. That's one of the things that we're especially concerned with was sort of drought effects post-fire, and how that might vary even just by something simple like soil depth. So, and as far as that's related to water holding capacity.
And Phil, what would that entail to obtain that data?
Probably higher resolution soil maps than what we have right now. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have that at, say, like a 30-meter resolution. And there might be parts of the landscape where that's possible, but yeah, not many right now.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, Loretta?
It did, yeah. We want to keep track of where are there major data gaps, and also including field data gaps, so that at some point, if we hit a point where a lot of research is stalled out because we don't have the field data, we should get it. And so just it's important to keep track. So thank you.
Makes sense.
Yeah, great question.
Appreciate the discussion, Phil. Greatly appreciate the time you spent here with us.
All right, well, thank you.
We're going to shift gears here. We've been talking about some land cover change issues and ecosystem response, and we're now going to be talking about some post-fire hazards. And so Colin Williams is going to give us a few remarks to kick off the next 3 talks. Colin is the director of our Geology, Minerals, Energy, and Geophysics Science Center. Colin, welcome.
Thank you, Darrin, and thank you, everyone. This is really interesting. In fact, I'm still pondering the information from the last 2 talks, which are great. As I said, thank you for having me and for having some of the representatives of our science center here. Our science center, we're pretty much what our name says: geology, minerals, energy, and geophysics, although you could also slip in a few other things I'll mention very briefly. Basically, we conduct sustained earth science research in support of the USGS mission, primarily focused on geologic processes and outcomes in Western North America and the Pacific Islands. But we conduct this research regionally, nationally, and globally as needed. And of course, as you'll see in the next few talks, collaborate with groups not just in the Southwest region, but elsewhere. So we work on things like natural resources, energy and minerals, predominantly, but also strong collaborations with our water mission area colleagues, framework geologic mapping, natural hazards. We have close ties with the landslide hazards program and the earthquake program, and some shared resources with the volcano hazards program, climate change studies, environmental health. And we also host the USGS National Innovation Center, which is trying to advance some of our technological capabilities within the USGS. I do want to mention that the next 3 talks, Darrin was very generous in putting Amy East and her collaborators in between the 2 bookends of Courtney and Jeff, and Amy, of course, is part of the Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center, and her colleagues are outside of our Science Center also. But I think the next 3 talks are going to highlight the various aspects of work that touch on post-fire issues related to debris flows and landslide hazards, basic geomorphology and geologic processes, a lot of which we focus on, water resources, sediment transport, etc. It's a very broad field. It touches on a lot of aspects of USGS science, and I think the next 3 talks will give you a really good idea as to how those different disciplines can and do come together. And with that, I think I will just stop.
Great, Colin. Appreciate it. Up next is Courtney Creamer, who's going to be giving us a talk on soil carbon and post-fire impacts.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And Yeah, I'm Courtney, and I study how soils respond to changes in disturbance and management regimes. And I'm super happy that we get to move below ground after those two really great talks before me. And today I'm going to talk about some work that myself and a colleague of mine, Andrea Foster, have been doing for the past year or two on the response of soil carbon and contaminants to fire in California. And just as a quick note, the soil carbon work is part of a larger project looking at the response of soils and microorganisms to changes in precipitation variability and fire regimes as a function of soil type. And the contaminant work is part of a larger project that's hopefully just going to be starting looking at contaminant mobilization from ultramafic soils and deposits. Next slide, please. So, after a fire, there are some changes in vegetation that can be readily apparent, which is shown by the sequence of photos taken after the LNU complex fires. And what we want to know is if there are corresponding changes below ground in soils like microbial recovery and succession in response to fire. And in particular, we want to know whether the processes that form soil organic matter, which are a function of the biota, and the potential capacity for a soil to store carbon, which is a function of the mineralogy, is influenced post-fire. Next slide, please. So we study changes in organic matter and soil organic matter by conceptualizing it into two functionally distinct pools. There's a particulate organic matter fraction and a mineral-associated organic matter fraction. And the schematic on the left is just showing a visualization of this. And the right-hand table provides some information on the functional differences between these two pools. But just really briefly, particulate organic matter is basically like plant and root litter, pieces of litter and roots. Whereas mineral-associated organic matter is formed when dissolved organic matter from plants, so exudates from the roots or leachates from leaf litter, can sorb directly onto a mineral surface, or if that dissolved organic matter is taken up into a microorganism that then will grow and die on that mineral surface. You can go to the next slide, please. And so we're particularly interested in this mineral pathway, which I'm highlighting with that red box. And in particular, how this pathway of mineral organic matter formation is influenced by soil type and soil microorganisms. And importantly, the types and quantities of minerals in soil influences the potential capacity of a soil to store organic matter, where the type, abundance, and activity of microorganisms in soils influences the efficiency by which mineral organic matter is formed. And both these processes influence short-term changes in organic matter in soils, but they also dictate the potential persistence or longevity of organic matter in soil. And I just want to note that these are really high research priorities and knowledge gaps across all ecosystems, not just those impacted by fire. And we do study it in a variety of ecosystems. And that carbon storage potential and carbon storage efficiency are things that are being examined in other ecosystems like agricultural systems because they can be sensitive to management. Next slide, please. So I just made a schematic of a burned ecosystem to give an example of our two-pool organic carbon model post-fire and just give an example of how this approach is applied. So next slide, please. So this is example data that highlights the utility of this approach in terms of isolating these functionally distinct pools and studying the response of organic matter to fire. So this is data from Adam Pellegrini, and it's a recent paper. And basically all it's showing is that prescribed burns, which are the red bars, decrease this particulate organic matter pool, which again is like leaf root litter, but not mineral associated organic matter, which is shown on the right hand side of the slide. And a loss of particulate carbon can occur, especially if you have lower intensity fires, like those that can occur during prescribed burns, or you don't have good deep thermal penetration of the heat down into the soil. But it also can occur changes in particulate organic matter if you have changes in vegetation that can result from changing fire regimes, either in terms of severity or frequency, interval of return. But in contrast, this mineral-associated organic matter, which is what we're looking at, the loss of it can occur during higher intensity fires where there's substantial heating of soil minerals. And just a brief note, we're really interested in this mineral organic matter because it's considered the longer term reservoir of carbon with turnover times like decadal to centennial turnover times, as opposed to particulate organic matter, which has a short turnover. Next slide, please. So again, we're interested in mineral-associated organic matter. And this is, again, because changes in this pool have a larger potential for legacy impacts because mineral-associated carbon has a longer resonance time. But importantly, too, we're focused on mineralogy because mineralogy is a function of soil parent material and soil age, which has a lot of impacts on carbon storage. And because mineralogy is a function of soil parent material and age, the trends we observe in terms of this dissolved organic matter microbial pathway in relation to mineralogy have the potential to be upscaled based upon soil type. So that's a big reason why we're looking at it in this context. And we focus on three main aspects that can change minerals and associated organic matter in response to fire. One is the mobilization, changes in the mobilization of dissolved organic matter and contaminants. The second is changes in mineralogy that can be induced via heating at temperature with fire. And the third is the efficiency by which microorganisms can form mineral-associated organic matter. And I'll just give two quick examples from lab and field studies of how these aspects can change with fire. Next slide, please. So this is work that was led by Andrea Foster, and she collected a soil that has serpentinite minerals in it. So these soils have elevated chromium and nickel, and they were experimentally heated. And the sequence of pictures just shows how you can visually observe that there are changes in mineralogy with temperature, particularly above 400 C. And if you have changes in mineralogy like this, they will alter organic matter storage, both directly in the context of the loss of the organics via heating, but also indirectly through changes in the reactivity of the minerals, particularly if you're moving from more reactive minerals like ferrihydrite at these lower temperatures to less reactive minerals like a goethite, for example, at higher temperatures. And like I've said a couple times now, these changes in mineralogy can result in legacy impacts depending on whether the minerals can return to their unheated state. And this is an active area of investigation and what we're going to continue doing. But Andrea was interested in the contaminant mobilization aspect. Next slide, please. And this is just a bar graph showing the quantity of leachable chromium, which is assumed to be chromium-6, which is a hazardous form of chromium, as a function of the temperature of the minerals at temperature at which these minerals in the pictures in the background were heated. And basically this is showing that there's greater leachability of chromium at temperatures above 400 C. So that what this means is that if you have a higher intensity fire in soils with appreciable amounts of chromium, like serpentinite soils, there's the potential to release chromium-6 into the environment. And so what we're working on and hoping to continue working on is whether this potential actually corresponds to an increased hazard risk in situ. So those are kind of the two big impacts that you can have with mineral heating. Next slide, please. And the other thing that I want to talk about is just give a quick example of some work looking at the importance of dissolved organic matter formation versus microbial activity in forming mineral-associated organic matter post-fire, and this is this DOM microbial pathway. So either via DOM sorption, dissolved organic matter sorption, or being taken up into a microorganism. And the data I'm going to show is from a field site where we've been collecting serpentinite and sandstone-derived soils at 10 sites for every 4 months after the LNU complex fires. And we're interested in the impacts and recovery of this pathway on mineral organic carbon formation. And so I'm going to show some data comparing dissolved organic matter production versus microbial recovery post-fire. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side of this figure is dissolved organic matter, and on the right-hand side is microbial biomass, so the total size of the microbial community. And the blue lines are the serpentinite-derived soils, and the orange line are sandstone-derived soils. And the x-axis of both figures is showing the time course of soils that were collected. And the y-axis is showing the response ratio of burned relative to unburned sites. So what this basically just means is that it's showing an increase in dissolved organic matter post-fire with the positive values on that dissolved organic matter graph, and a decrease in microbial biomass post-fire, which is shown by the negative values on that slide. And anything closer to 0 means it's more similar to the unburned state. So that shows, for example, in the sandstone-derived soils, there's greater similarity to the unburned sites post-fire. So basically, this is showing that after this fire, mineral-associated organic matter will be formed predominantly through the absorption of dissolved organic matter, since it's elevated, rather than microbial turnover post-fire, since it's the microorganisms have been killed. And that this effect continues 9 months after fire. And it also shows the effects are more dramatic on serpentine soils, and these soils have a greater number of clay minerals. And this dominance of dissolved organic matter absorption versus microbial formation of mineral-associated organic matter matters, because we've shown in other ecosystems that mineral-associated organic matter formed by dissolved organic matter absorption is vulnerable to loss. And so we're continuing to collect more data on this and investigate legacy effects of this particular fire, but we're also planning on investigating whether wildfire frequency and intensity in other soils influences this mineral carbon storage. Next slide, please. So from our data, I think there's a couple of things that we can conclude. So the first thing is that I actually didn't talk about in this presentation at all, but we do know that vegetation changes with wildfire change soil organic matter, and that's a pretty widely observed phenomenon. And we have had some good examples in this this talk about vegetation responses to fire. So I know I didn't talk about this, but I've done quite a bit of work in other ecosystems outside of California, in Texas and Australia, looking at the effects of certain types of management like fire suppression on vegetation changes, which then influence organic matter cycling and nutrient availability. And I think the important point from this is that if we care about ecosystem carbon storage, we should definitely measure changes in organic matter quantities and processes, and vegetation changes are a good indicator that something is going to also be happening below ground. I showed some evidence here that severe fires can alter mineralogy, and like we showed, this has the potential for changes in contaminant mobilization, as well as the potential for carbon to be stored in that ecosystem in the future. And finally, we have shown that the mechanism by which mineral carbon is formed can be influenced by fire, which has the potential to change its vulnerability to loss. So one more slide. So if we're thinking about management of ecosystems, I think what we can take from what I just said is that there's the possibility to selectively target certain ecosystems for management based upon the chance that we could observe either changes in vegetation as a result of prescribed fire or fire frequency, or in relation to soil type and mineralogy, with the aim of trying to minimize the loss of desired soil and microbial functions. So what we could do is think about soils that would be most vulnerable to changes with severe fires. So for example, like the serpentinite-derived soils that I talked about in this presentation, because they showed changes in both contaminant mobilization and the mechanism of mineral-associated organic carbon loss. So
we really should try to wrap up.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
No worries.
That's basically it. So just think about the fire intensity, and that we can try to use this to understand the potential for soils to store carbon. Sorry.
You did great.
I get really talky when I.
No, hey, I could listen to you all day. This is great. No, I just want to leave time for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. So who's got a question for Courtney? Feel free to raise your hand, or here we go, Adam Moreno.
Yeah, sorry, I got a question for everybody all the time. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Courtney. Great presentation. Lots of information. I'm not sure I absorbed everything, but so first here you're talking about vulnerability. This is my most recent question because it's right here on the slide. Do you think you can map vulnerability statewide?
So that is what we are hoping to do. So if right now we're trying to create relationships between changes in process rates of soil carbon stabilization as related to soil mineralogy. So if we have maps of soil type or soil mineralogy, that is what we are aiming to do. I think the thing is, though, that we need to understand that there's a great deal of uncertainty with any of these types of measurements, because soil carbon takes so long to change, especially mineral-associated organic carbon. It's really, really important to include that uncertainty in any type of estimates that we're doing.
Right, great, okay. Wait, so you're planning on trying to map this vulnerability, like with some new research or something. Again, I guess this goes back to Loretta's question about what data is missing for you to be able to do this.
Yeah, so in terms of the context of fire, there's quite a bit of field data that is really useful because we really need to have a comparison to an unburned state. So like establishing baselines of soil carbon and soil organic matter to compare how it would respond to disturbance is incredibly important. And due to the fact that wildfires are often random, or we can't predict exactly where they're going to be, and oftentimes it's hard to know the extent to which the soil was heated. There's quite a bit of data missing in that area. I think the other thing that I'll just briefly mention is that probably in the past 10 years or so, soil science has kind of undergone a change in terms of how we understand how carbon is stabilized in soil. And so some of the biogeochemical models that help us understand how organic matter will respond to fire don't often incorporate some of the aspects that we are interested in, such as they're only recently beginning to include microorganisms explicitly, and some of them only proxy soil mineralogy as texture. So I would say field data that we can compare fire frequency with unburned controls are very helpful. Doing laboratory experiments like what Andrea did, looking at fire temperature on these processes, so we could potentially parameterize models that would help us understand the response to like change in the future. And there are some biogeochemical models that we can use, especially if they're tailored to a particular ecosystem. But I would say those are the big gaps.
Okay, just a quick question. Do you have a publication on the carbon storage potential that you could share? How you do that?
Oh, yes. I actually, will you go to the next slide, Alicia? Sorry. I actually put all these references in here. I can share them with you specifically because I know I went through a lot of information. I just wrote a couple that I felt were particularly seminal publications, but I can send you that one in particular.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. I think you should have Adam's information on email that we sent you, but I think his email's right showing on the attendance list. Looks like Alan Talhelm with the Air Resources Board's got a question.
Hi, thanks a lot. This soils presentation is really interesting. Most of what you talked about, but a lot of emphasis in your talk was about serpentine soils. What is the comparative vulnerability of other soil types, particularly like granitic soil types, to wildfire?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are trying to extend our work into other soil types, into granitic soil types as well. It's really going to be a function of how hot the soil gets in terms of mineral carbon storage, and then whether those minerals will be thermally altered. And the types of minerals, it has to do with the parent material, but also has to do with the age. So if you have a really young soil, this issue where I'm talking about in terms of thermal alteration of clays is going to be less of an issue. So part of the reason we focus on serpentinite versus sandstone soils is that that's the work that we've been doing for the past year or so, in part because serpentine soils have the potential for contaminant mobilization. So I would say, I guess in short, it's going to be variable, and it's going to be largely a function of the age of the soil in addition to its parent material. But if they have fewer clays and fewer minerals, and they are not as heated, it's possible that nothing could happen if you have a low intensity fire.
Thanks for the question. And looks like Nathaniel Roth with the Department of Conservation has a question.
So I'm trying to read a little bit between the lines here, but as you're suggesting data that's missing, particularly field data with sampling that's both burned and controlled unburned, it sounds to me like it might be prudent if we were to devise that sampling regime for large area coverage across the state, that we should also be ensuring that we've got representative coverage of fuels management practices planned into that. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, that's a great assumption. Yes. And I would say also, like, if there's any way that temperature is going to be a huge thing. So like the depth of the soil heating and how long elevated temperatures are remaining. So because like I said, if you have a quick fire that's low intensity, sometimes sometimes the heat penetration can last for just less than a second, and it doesn't penetrate very deeply. And then a lot of these issues that I'm talking about in terms of microbes dying are not going to happen. So yes, all of that. And I would also say temperature, soil temperature.
Okay, and looks like we've got 1 minute for a quick last question from Bill Short with the Department of Conservation.
Hi, kind of following on Nate's question real quick. So can you relate your work to the soil burn severity that is monitored after any of these fires directly, and then correlate it to low, medium, high, very high severity?
Yes, we can, and we're doing that for the LMU fire work. We're taking those types of incorporating that type of data as well. So yeah, that's a great way of doing it too. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Courtney. And if you've got more information, I'm sure they'd appreciate receiving it on those topics. We do need to shift gears. Our next talk is a collaboration between Amy East with Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center, Scott Wright with the California Water Science Center, and Jason Kean with the Landslides Hazard Program. And this talk is entitled Evaluating Physical Landscape Response to Fire and Post-Fire Rainfall in California. Amy, it's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to discuss the USGS capabilities for investigating physical landscape response after fire. And as Darrin mentioned, I'm speaking on behalf of Coastal and Marine Hazards and Resources program that I work within, which is part of USGS Natural Hazards Mission Area, and Scott Wright's team within USGS Water Mission Area, and also a team within the USGS Landslide Hazards program led by Jason Kean in Golden, Colorado. We also work closely with GMEG, the team that Colin leads. Next slide, please. The USGS mission is increasingly focused on fire and post-fire hazards. Our 2022 agency guidance includes hazards and risk modeling in recently burned areas, one reason for which is, of course, to better understand cascading consequences of extreme events compounded by climate change, such as fire followed by intense rain. So our physical process research falls mostly into two categories. The first is post-fire debris flow hazards. So understanding what processes on hill slopes and in channels and what properties of terrain, fire history, and rainfall lead to debris flows that jeopardize life and property. And number two, sediment production after fire and its effects on water resources. So even where debris flows do not form, burned landscapes produce elevated sediment yields for about 2 to 7 years after fire. And as that excess material moves downstream to lakes and reservoirs, it may fill enough space to reduce water storage capacity. With the growth in post-fire research over the last 10 to 20 years, we know a fair amount about post-fire landscape behavior in some regions, but many areas are more fire-prone now than 20 years ago. And across large regions, few data exist on both these types of problems. Northern California is especially one of those understudied regions. Next slide. A USGS landslide hazards team led by Jason Kean and Dennis Staley uses slope, soil burn severity, and erodibility factors to estimate the likelihood of post-fire debris flows for a storm with a given rain intensity. This is showing an example. This is their model output for the CZU fire last August. The colors on the map indicate how likely a debris flow would be in different basins, given rain above a threshold intensity. Maps like this are used by state and local agencies to guide evacuations ahead of storms. A major question is what threshold rain intensity should be used in these models. Rain intensities capable of triggering debris flows in one area might be higher or lower than the threshold values elsewhere. And over much of California, the field data that could validate these threshold assumptions are absent or scarce. Next slide. To refine the rain thresholds used in debris flow hazard modeling, the USGS and CGS have been working together to collect on-the-ground rain data in burned areas, and then to match up measured rain intensities with observed landscape response. For one example, we deployed rain gauges and cameras in the CZU fire area last fall, and then after storms, we examined the rain records. The plot on this slide is rain intensity measured during a storm in January, and then looked for field evidence of debris flows and other geomorphic change. A higher budget approach would also include installing pressure transducers or geophones to monitor debris flow activity. Jason Kean's team uses these field data to decide whether to shift regional thresholds in their next model iteration for that burned area. And I think our next talk by Jeff Prancevic will discuss debris flow processes in more detail. Next slide. As I mentioned, we know that landscapes produce more sediment after a fire, but how much more varies widely. Geospatial models can be used to predict regional post-fire erosion rates, but the models eventually need to be ground-truthed, and over much of Northern California, field validation data have been sparse. There are two main ways to close that data gap. One is to measure the volume changes in sediment deposits at the downstream end of a watershed using repeat topographic mapping. And the other method is to use a stream gauge and direct water sampling or turbidity measurements to calculate how much material a stream is transporting. Next slide, please. We used geomorphic change detection to measure sediment yields after the Carr Fire burned all of the area around Whiskeytown Lake west of Redding. We mapped Whiskeytown Lake shortly after the fire and 2 more times over the next 2 years. This involved bathymetric mapping from a boat combined with aerial photography when the lake level was low to image the new deposits at the creek outlets. So you map the land surface at 2 different times and then use GIS to calculate the volume differences between those surfaces. We determined that the largest yields occurred from a basin called Brandy Creek, which produced about 64 times more material per unit area than it had before the fire. The figures on the left here show volume changes at the outlet of Brandy Creek. The blue and red are deposition and eroding areas, respectively. The total new sediment input to the lake in the first year after the fire was 111,000 cubic meters, which was not enough to reduce water storage capacity very much for this large of a lake, but would have been problematic in a smaller reservoir. Other smaller California reservoirs have lost much of their storage capacity from just one post-fire runoff season. Next slide. Stream gauging and turbidity measurements provide another means to track post-fire sediment transport. After the 2013 rim fire in the Tuolumne Basin, Scott Wright and his colleagues installed a new stream gauge and turbidity meter above Don Pedro Reservoir. They used these to identify pulses of new post-fire runoff and then measured turbidity profiles along 23 kilometers downstream. They found turbidity currents moving down the lake after storms. These currents take 1 to 2 weeks to traverse the length of Don Pedro Reservoir. Additional work by the Modesto Irrigation District indicated that the post-fire deposits had elevated concentrations of metals. So this has implications for water quality as well. And I believe the talks in week 3 of these meetings will discuss post-fire water quality in detail. Next slide, please. One reason our coastal and marine team is interested in fire is because where a burned basin drains directly to the coast, post-fire debris flows or sediment-rich floods affect coastal and estuarine morphology, ecosystems, and water quality. My colleague John Warwick is writing up a study of coastal change downdrift of the Big Sur River Basin, which burned in 2016. Post-fire floods in 2017 brought enough sand out to the coast to widen the beaches there for a few miles down coast for about 3 years. Other USGS coastal and marine colleagues are measuring geochemical response in coastal areas downstream of the CZU fire also. Next slide. Another research goal worth exploring would be to develop statewide estimates of post-fire landscape change using a sediment budget approach. Basically an accounting of sources and sinks resulting from fires over the past 20 or so years. This analysis could be done using the fire perimeter GIS data from the CAL FIRE database, combined with modeled or field verified data on sediment yield. This approach could identify spatial and temporal changes and trends over recent decades and determine where sediment-related risk is distributed due to fire in coastal versus inland areas or north versus south, how much new sediment is going into reservoirs versus coming out to the coast, and so on. I'd welcome input on optimal approaches to this type of whole landscape scale assessment. Next slide.
Thanks, and Amy, just FYI, it looks like you've got about 2 minutes left.
Got it. To summarize USGS capabilities for studying physical landscape response to fire, we measure hill slope processes and how those and rain characteristics affect debris flow hazards. We use geomorphic change detection, stream gauging, and turbidity measurements. Our mapping capabilities include LiDAR, aerial imaging from drones or aircraft, structure from motion, traditional total station surveys, and for work underwater, we map from boats and jet skis. Our coastal marine office also has geochemistry labs and can collect and analyze cores. Water Science Centers, of course, have other water quality instrumentation capabilities that Scott can elaborate on. Next slide. To wrap up, state agencies are already important partners of the USGS in post-fire assessments. These collaborations are also moving into pre-fire hazard assessments. Opportunities for expanded collaboration include further refining definition of rain thresholds for debris flows and working more closely with water resource managers to measure post-fire effects on streams and reservoirs. We'd love to hear more from you about how the USGS could be more useful at providing data that state agencies need. I think we'd agree there is a large need for more field data, especially from Northern California. It does help to have longer-term plans in place before a fire. Knowing what resources are available and planning for them to be allocated ahead of time makes rapid response more feasible, especially when we're rushing to collect the field data between when a fire happens in August and then when it starts raining in the fall. So we have a lot of research interest, and we'd like to hear more of what our cooperators need and how can we be more useful. Thank you.
That's great, Amy. Much appreciated. So Amy posed a couple questions for our state of California friends as to how we can be most useful to you. So I'd put that question to our partners, and also anyone that has a question on anything that Amy presented, please do ask. You can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Bill Short with the Department of Conservation.
Howdy. Yeah, Bill Short with the California Geological Survey, part of the Department of Conservation.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think from our standpoint, and I think it's obvious to Amy and Jason and others at the USGS that we do work with, is more collaboration is better, and on the things we already are doing, and figuring out ways that we all can get more funding for the ideas that you put here are really the key, because we are focusing as a group on trying to refine data in Northern California, and availability of instrumentation as well as availability of time are our key limitations.
Absolutely, thanks, Bill. And I've really enjoyed working with folks like Don Lindsay and Dave Longstreth from your team. Also, we have a great collaboration going. I expect we're going to expand that more this fall. We're talking about ways to collaborate on field work for the Dixie Fire in the next few weeks, actually.
Thanks for that thought, Bill. If I can ask you a question, you said more collaboration is better. We totally agree. Are there sort of obvious opportunities that we should be taking advantage of for those collaboration sort of events? Is there something you would recommend we participate in that we're not, or participate in to a greater degree?
From my standpoint, that collaboration is ongoing. I think it would be always beneficial if after some of these significant fires, if we collaborate directly with the parties involved to understand more clearly other opportunities where we can collect this data and where it makes sense from the scientific standpoint. Dixie Fire is obviously good because of its values, Feather River watershed, etc., and being a large, high-intensity fire. Obviously, Caldor Fire is one as well, both in the Tahoe Basin and in the Cosumnes watershed. So I think maybe if we can set up some conversations after we've run through some of these larger fires and talk about them directly one-to-one, that might help. And I mean one-to-one as in directly, not limiting the group.
Very good. Much appreciated, Bill. Nate Roth has got a question.
Yeah, so I'm really interested, and this has been a pet project of mine for some time, in the establishment of statewide LiDAR coverage. So one of the areas that you emphasized being significant was topographic differencing, that I'm assuming benefits greatly from having both pre and then multiple post event sets of collections. How valuable, and I'm sure this can't be a truly quantified monetary value, but how significant is having that high quality LiDAR data prior to event to those types of analyses?
That's a great question. It is extremely valuable. That would be our ideal scenario, would be to have airborne LiDAR, high resolution airborne LiDAR, as recently before the fire as possible, and then as soon after fire and then post-fire rain events would be ideal. So, within a rainy season after the fire, as well as shortly before the fire, would be ideal. I mean, that's what everyone wants. That's our dream come true, really. It's just a question of cost. Yeah, if the money was available to do that, that would absolutely be the best way to initiate geomorphic change detection studies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill Short, again, following up real quick. Yeah, if we look at the Dixie Fire, we've got areas that have no LiDAR. So if there are ways to gather LiDAR for that additional footprint before it rains, that would be very important. Again, high cost and rapid deployment for accurate data, but that would really help in some of these studies where we have nothing at all pre-fire. forward before it rains.
Amy, any additional thoughts based on what Bill mentioned?
Just one last comment. We do, I mean, it is also valuable to have pre and post fire aerial photography, but the type of high resolution quantitative surface change detection that gives us sediment volumes and yields and debris flow activity cannot be done with photography, because you need to remove the vegetation layer and get the bare earth LiDAR to do the types of quantitative change detection that we have been trying after the car fire, for instance.
Thank you. And we do have time for more questions for Amy. Amy, can you give us a sense? So, obviously resources are always the limiting factor to doing these additional studies. And we've got, John Stock mentioned our 3-DEP program that we do our best to get needed LiDAR information in the pipeline. Can you give us a sense of what's involved in applying for those LiDAR overflights and what kind of time frame that usually takes?
Gosh, I wonder if Jason would prefer to answer this question. He's probably had more success with that than I have. Any thoughts, Jason Kean, if you're on?
Actually, I have limited experience in procuring rapid LiDAR flights, so I've just been lucky to use them when we've gotten them. Maybe John Stock has some thoughts on that.
My thoughts are Mike Tishley, who runs that program, is very open to cost sharing, and they do a broad area announcement, which makes the rapid response somewhat difficult. But I think they'd be open to a more rapid response if there was significant cost matching.
That's the difficulty on our end, is the cost matching. I mean, as you all know, the fires tend to happen late in the fiscal year or at the very beginning of the next fiscal year. So trying to find the money at that particular time of year, post-fire, pre-rain, is not easy for the feds anyway.
Well, we've got 3 questions and 2 minutes, so if we can rapidly go through Nate's first, and then Griffin's, and then Colin's, and that probably will be about it.
Yeah. So this is Nate. First one, the broad agency announcement. In case, Carol Ostergren, Drew Decker are good contacts. We've also heard that there have been some other folks that are interested in LiDAR coverages for Dixie, Beckworth Complex, North Complex, being collected relatively soon, though probably my current word is probably not prior to this rainy season. Pay attention to the BAA. It's open now with USGS, closes on October 1st. So the window of opportunity, if you have any funding available, is as open right now as possible to get in on those next sets of collections.
Thanks for that, Nate. Really appreciate it. Griffin.
Sorry, fumbling with my mouse. Griffin Perea with the Central Valley Water Board. I was just going to offer up, I'm sure some folks are aware, but the Shasta Trinity National Forest did do a LiDAR study after the Bagley fire, which is northeast of Lake Shasta, or kind of just north of Lake Shasta. And Steve Bachman was the hydrologist that kind of led that. So it's just more of a putting that out there if there are questions about costs or maybe how they were able to deploy it so quickly after the fire. And they did it specifically for erosion and sediment production studies. So just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Griffin. Appreciate it. And last but not least, Colin.
Thanks, Darrin, and thank you, Amy. That was an awesome presentation. On the LiDAR thing, I just want to mention that, and some people probably know this, that not long before the pandemic, Kevin Gallagher, who's the USGS Associate Director, runs Core Science Systems, which oversees the 3-DEP program, came through California and said he had agreed with the state of California that there was going to be a very significant line item. It was tens of millions of dollars to cover the state in LiDAR data. And then, of course, COVID happened, and I know that's been a big disruption to both the state and its budget planning and the federal government. But it might be worth trying to see where where that original agreement stands, because that would be that baseline pre-fire high resolution data that would be invaluable, and then provide the opportunity to target post-fire data collection relative to that.
We'll do that, Colin. Appreciate that. And Loretta.
I was just going to say regarding the LIDAR piece, at least from the Natural Resources Agency side, we're waiting upon the legislature to consider funding for it's kind of earmarked for remote sensing acquisitions and analytics, and some portion of that is expected to go towards LIDAR. It's unclear exactly how much the legislature is looking to allocate. So we should know in the next, I think, week where that lands. So we'll certainly follow up about next steps there. It's on our minds, but it certainly doesn't look like, what was originally conceived of before the pandemic.
Thanks, Loretta. Appreciate it. Great discussion, everyone. Thank you so much, Amy. And we need to shift to our last talk for today. We'll shift gears to Jeff Prancevic on post-fire debris flows. Jeff, it's all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Prancevic, and I am representing a team of geomorphologists and hydrologists at the GMEG Science Center, as well as the California Water Science Center, all trying to understand post-wildfire hazards in California. And it's nice to be able to follow up on Amy's talk, because a lot of the stuff we're doing is pretty complementary, and I think some of the discussion might be the same. I will mention our needs for LIDAR as well, which are similar to Amy's. So I'm showing you two photos of post-fire debris flows from Southern California. Of course, post-fire hazards include those striking and devastating debris flows that sometimes happen. They also include post-fire flooding, as well as increased sediment and contaminant loads to California's reservoirs. And to understand these hazards, we're really taking a process-based approach where we're trying to understand how fire actually impacts the physical state of the soil that impacts runoff and sediment availability for these hazards. So next slide, please. So yeah, I'm going to use the framework in this talk of sort of three ingredients that are driving post-fire hazards. And so places that have all three of these ingredients will tend to have the largest risk after a wildfire. So runoff, which has fast-moving water moving over the landscape, the availability of loose and erodible sediment that can be entrained by that flowing water as it's passing over, potentially bulk up, or potentially also generate debris flows, and then also steep topography that gets these things moving quickly. Now, fire will impact two of these ingredients, and if you could switch to the next slide, fire can release sediment that's otherwise bound or trapped by vegetation, and it can release it into stream channels or just make it available to be entrained by overland flow. Fire can also increase runoff by sealing the soil and reducing the vegetation canopy that might otherwise intercept some of the rainfall. Meanwhile, steep topography is a necessary ingredient for a lot of hazards, but it's not impacted by fire directly. So I'm going to spend the next few slides going over each of these ingredients and how we think about them and what we're doing to understand them. So if you can go to the next slide. So increased runoff is the most common explanation for post-fire floods and debris flows. If you look in the newspaper after a major fire in California, you'll probably see an infographic that looks something like this, where you burn vegetation. That burning of the vegetation creates a water repellent layer in the soil. And then when it rains, instead of that water infiltrating into the ground, more of it will run over the surface and potentially create floods or debris flows. Of course, that's not the only thing that fires do. And if you can move to the next slide, please. If you've walked around in some of the landscapes in Southern California, particularly the San Gabriel Mountains after fire, you might see that there's a lot of fine sediment in the channel network. So here's a couple of photos following the Colby fire in Southern California. And the photo on the left is after the fire, but before the first rainstorm. And you can see that there are pretty large talus cones. There's a person in the right-hand photo for scale. Basically a lot of fine sediment that's filled in the channel. The right-hand photo is after the first rainstorm that came through this place and this catchment and actually eroded over a meter of this fine sediment and did cause some debris flow. So this is just to illustrate, the photo on the left would not look this way unfortunately, we don't have a photo from before the fire, but most of the channels in the San Gabriel Mountains have bedrock or coarse boulders, and they aren't filled with this fine sediment. And it's really that accumulation of fine sediment that contributes to debris flow generation in some landscapes. So finally, I want to talk about steep topography, which is on the next slide. So steep topography is something that we can more easily measure, and it's a primary component in the USGS emergency hazard assessment that's put out by the Landslide Hazards Program after most major fires in California. And these are awesome tools for identifying which catchments are potentially most hazardous. And they rely on the topographic slope, they rely on burn severity and on soil erodibility maps from the USDA. But what they aren't able to capture, and if you can move to the next slide, are how different landscapes respond to fire in terms of runoff and sediment availability. So those two slides that I showed previously, like how does water repellency vary following fire in different landscapes, and how does sediment availability vary between different landscapes? So those are the kind of measurements that we're trying to make to better understand site-specific risks after fire. Because while these predictions or hazard assessments are extremely useful, they don't do a fantastic job in all landscapes, just due to the variability. And to illustrate that variability, the next slide shows a couple of maps. So this is just, very broad overview of the diversity of Californian geology and vegetation. And there's nothing much to say here except that, as I'm sure many of you know, California is extremely diverse, and it's not clear at all that each part of the state and these different landscapes will react the same way to fire. And it seems, based on our measurements, that they do not. So next slide, please. So what we're trying to do to understand the impact of these different landscapes on hazards from a process-based perspective is to actually go out and measure infiltration rates at different sites. And we've done that using mini disc infiltrometers, which are these small devices that you'd see Karina and I using on this steep hillslope after a fire. And where we've done this in Northern California, we have found that vegetation does impact how the soils respond hydrologically to fire. We find that in conifer forests, infiltration rates do go down after fire, but infiltration rates actually seem to increase in some chaparral landscapes. So meaning the soil can actually take up more water after the fire than before. And we've also found that it can take up to 4 years for the soil to recover and achieve sort of pre-fire infiltration rates. So the next slide, I don't know if, sorry, it's half blurry for me. I don't know if it was like that for other people. So we're also trying to map out gravel accumulation throughout Northern California. And we've just been doing this for a couple of fires to see where there have been big accumulations of sediment after fire. And generally, it seems that Northern California has less gravel accumulation than Southern California, and those piles are smaller, which suggests that there's less sediment available for debris flows. We suspect that this varies with rock type and erosion rate, but our surveys so far have been pretty limited. And this is where having post-fire, pre-rainfall LiDAR would be extremely helpful. So that's just to echo the need for more LiDAR, especially in places where we already have LiDAR from before the fire. So we have a baseline amount of change to know where channels are loaded with fine sediment. So the next slide is just a summary, and I can stop there and take questions.
You've got another minute if you want to go through the summary slide there, Jeff.
Okay, great. So yeah, just to summarize, to improve post-wildfire hazard predictions, we are measuring how fire impacts runoff generation and sediment supply in different ecosystems and rock types. There aren't generalizable models to do this across the state of California, and our field measurements are hopefully going to help inform future site-specific hazard assessments. So with that, happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Who's got a question for Jeff? Don't be shy. Looks like Keith and then Bill.
Hi, thanks. Very nice presentation. When you say you're looking at different ecosystems, does that include the very arid lands in California, the near desert, where we are seeing increase in invasive grasses in that system? And would you predict that that system would see substantial changes in sediment composition?
We have been pretty focused on Northern California. We haven't, this work was only started a few years ago, and it's been growing in terms of our scope and footprint that we're trying to cover. We've mostly been focused on the northern San Francisco Bay Area. And so no, we haven't looked at very arid landscapes. I can say that in terms of sediment composition or sediment availability in arid landscapes, well, and you mentioned specifically in terms of grasslands, I don't know if I can speak to that directly, but in terms of infiltration rates, we've seen that grassland have experienced the smallest hydrologic impact after fire. And I don't know if that's true across all grasslands, but that is true where we've measured in northern San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, my curiosity is if the sediments are changing in these environments, because grasses weren't a very big part of these very arid environments, and therefore, if there's changes in the sediments, would that lend itself to the fact that grasses may be a huge problem going into the future with fire frequency and severity in desert lands, and that we might be looking at something that may not be a reverse back to the natural vegetation that we're normally seeing? And it's just a curiosity when we're looking at this, that we should probably be looking at that these changes in sediments and how they may impact going into the future. We may be trying to put natural vegetation back that just won't take anymore. So that's why I had the curiosity. So we probably should talk a little bit more offline about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, we haven't looked at sort of long-term changes in soil coverage after fires, but I agree that that is something that deserves attention.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Thanks for that, Keith. Really appreciate it. Bill Short.
Yeah, I know you guys are working on some of the fires in the North Bay. Could you kind of go through a rundown of where you've been doing your infiltrometer testing and
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've worked in the Tubbs and Nuns fire, which was actually before I started the survey. We've recently worked on the Kincaid fire from 2019, and then following the 2020, all the large fires surrounding the bay, have worked mostly in the LNU, Wallbridge, and Glass fires. And this year we're like many other people, really interested in looking at the Dixie Fire to see what's going to happen up there.
Great, thank you. And you're not doing anything in the CZU where we've got a lot of redwood and forested lands as of yet?
No, so I did visit that landscape and made a couple of measurements, but we didn't focus there. I think that folks from the Landside Hazards program have made infiltration measurements in the CZU, and Jason can confirm that if it's true, if he's still on the call.
Yes, that is true, Bill. Matt Thomas from our group is doing a series of repeat transects of infiltration in CZU in coordination with Amy East.
Great, thank you.
And let's see, there's a question in the chat that Loretta asked. Are there tool applications to address front-end vulnerabilities pre-fire with regards to hazards so we can preemptively consider treatments or stabilization measures in areas where we would expect post-fire hazards to result in elevated concern given proximate assets or resources? Amy East says yes, Matt Thomas has, but Jeff, would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I think Amy's answer was in response to the infiltration measurements in CZU, so not answering that previous question. Does
that make sense? So, I just typed it in. It was a little long-winded. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think certainly. I was thinking about this while during the first talk by John about the chaparral landscapes not being good candidates for treatments, and those are the landscapes that so far from our measurements seem to actually hydrologically not be super impacted, at least in Northern California. So those are places that I think we with a lot of caution, maybe don't have to worry about so much in terms of the hydrological response after fire. So that would be something to consider in terms of treatments and stabilization measures. But yeah, I mean, all of this.
Pre-fire, like, as we're prioritizing our treatments, we're looking at high value natural resource assets, human, vulnerable communities, broadly speaking. And I was just thinking that if we're weaving in other things like, okay, this area also, from a geologic hazard standpoint is also a priority. If we could just be layering that into our considerations, and we can kind of tighten and refine where we do treatments so that we don't have this post-fire issue, like we have to deal with the ramifications after a fire. If we could get ahead of it, and if that's even of value or merit, it just seems like something we could be including in our assessments of where to do treatments.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing that we haven't really focused on too much in our work so far, but is in the back, really it's something that we're thinking about, is soil burn severity and its role in determining these responses. And, if prescribed burns are lower severity and therefore don't have the same impacts, that would change the calculus in terms of deciding where to have these things. All good questions, and all things that we're interested in understanding.
Thanks, Loretta. Nate Roth's got a question for you, Jeff.
It's actually more a comment. I believe that Bill Short and some of the CGS folks may have been working on a concept for a pre-fire WERT type assessment. Isn't that correct, Bill? Jeremy?
Yeah, that's true. We are working on that, and we're working closely with Jason and Amy as well. And we're focusing just on trying to identify where the greatest hazards are from a public safety standpoint. But it would have benefit, I think, towards these treatments. At least understanding where the highest risk is from a wildfire. And then further data would be needed to determine whether low intensity fire in some of these areas might be beneficial to reduce that risk for high intensity fire while limiting any ecologic or public safety impacts.
Okay, well, Jeff, we really appreciate your presentation, appreciate all the questions and engagement. And that really does wrap it up for today's session. We really appreciate everyone that attended. Thanks to all the work that the presenters went through. It takes a lot to create these presentations and go through them and then give them, of course, and it takes a lot of time out. Thanks to Alicia Torregrosa, who ran these PowerPoint slides, very, very helpful. And I want to just mention, there's been a couple of publications and attachments that have been attached to the chat in response to people's questions. If you've got any of those that you've done that with, or if you've got any additional information you would hope to provide this group, please send that to Alicia Torregrosa. And when this is done, she can forward all that information out as a package to everyone that attended today's meeting. If you had a question that you wish you had asked but didn't have a chance to, we invite you to connect with any of our presenters after today's workshop using the contact information we've provided. We want you all to know that the work we're doing here at USGS is truly meaningless if it's not applicable to managers like yourself. So please don't hesitate to contact me or any of the presenters you've heard today to express important needs or pursue collaborative research opportunities. And it looks like one of those collaborations that sprung from today's discussion is the pressing need for LiDAR right now. And John Stock, really appreciate you moving forward with seeing about some discussions on that. So that's it for me. Loretta, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to give?
I just want to thank this entire team for this outstanding series of presentations and all the work that went into it. And I think beyond the LiDAR piece, I think there's actually a lot of follow-up emails you'll expect from our team. There's a lot of threads to follow up on. And I just think this workshop and the next couple workshops will expose a lot of opportunities for us to tap into your wealth of resources. So thanks again for putting this on. And we're looking forward to, I think it's Friday, the next meeting. Thursday?
Yeah, you bet. It's our pleasure, Loretta. Yeah, Friday at 9 o'clock. If you haven't received an invitation to that and would like to go, just connect with myself or Loretta. We'll forward you the invite and look forward to you being there. So thanks, everyone, and have a great short week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.